I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And welcome to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about the 2011 film Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which we watched today.
We just watched it, and we're going to talk about it very loudly. Okay. Extremely loud and incredibly close after viewing.
I see. It took me a second to catch on to that one. Nate, this is your first time seeing this film, right?
It is.
Yeah. I've watched it a few times. I watched it the year it came out. This was my favorite for Best Picture at the 2012 Oscars. Of course, this was released in 2011 for the 2012 Oscars. This was my pick for Best Picture. And also, I have very strong feelings about the fact that Max Von Sydow should have won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor that year, which ultimately went to Christopher Plummer.
Yeah, and the Best Picture winner that year went to The Artist, which
I still haven't seen.
It's a little bit of a blip.
I still haven't seen, and I still have pretty much no motivation to see.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I enjoyed it, but I don't think it's aged very well as an Oscar winner. I don't think it was one for the ages. Yeah. My favorite film of the Oscar nominees that year would have definitely been the Alexander Payne film, The Descendants.
So on your first viewing, granted, we just finished this, and this is kind of a film that, as you and I have already discussed, requires a little bit of digesting.
Yeah, so I am going to have to digest this, and so a lot of this is first impressions. I came in not expecting to like this film.
And why is that?
A couple of reasons. So I read a number of years ago that of all the Best Picture nominated movies, that this had the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score of any Best Picture nominee.
Okay.
At the time it got its nomination, it had like a 51, 52. And now it's down to a 46 because there's later reviews for the DVD and the other market that came out subsequently. And I can see why this would be a film that would divide people.
Yeah.
I feel that it's really a mixed bag of a film. It is based on a 2005 novel by the same name by a man named Jonathan Safran Foer. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
Yeah.
He also wrote a book that was adapted into a movie called Everything is Illuminated. Now, I've read neither of the books. I've not read Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close, or Everything is Illuminated. I really disliked Everything is Illuminated. I thought it was way too cutesy. It's a story about a man, played by Elijah Wood, who goes to Europe to kind of track down what happened to, I think, his grandparents in the Holocaust. But it had this kind of light mystical motif, which this film does, especially towards the beginning. It's kind of this playful child's perspective fantasy. It's a game. And it's a little similar to the reaction I had with Reign Over Me, where I'm very, and I don't know entirely why it is. It's not that I have a particular 9/11 thing, but when you take a different storyline that's not necessarily a 9/11 storyline and then you impose it on 9/11, I'm suspicious of that on a certain level, and I'm not immediately open to it.
Okay.
And that really affected the way I came into this film, and I did not care for the early part of the film. I think it improved as it went on, but I have very mixed feelings about this film.
Any other reasons you were prone to dislike it going into it? Or it's mostly just based on what you'd heard about it?
Mostly based on my experience with the author and the surveys and the 9/11 thing.
How would you say your first opinion of it, how would you say your opinion of it has shifted after this first viewing?
Well, again, this is one I'm going to have to think about. So when I give my final rating on it, it very well could change after I've had a little more time to process it. It's a little gimmicky. It's a little cutesy. The kid,
Thomas Horn,
has
he plays Oscar Schell.
He's not an actor. And I kept thinking throughout that I wish someone of the caliber of a young Haley Joel Osment was in this part. And part of the reason that the performance didn't work for me is also part of the reason why the performance is arguably good. Because this character is autistic, and so he's not reacting...
Or Asperger's or something.
Yeah, so he's not reacting to things normally.
Yeah.
And so what may seem off about the performance may actually indicate a good performance of a character with this condition.
Yeah. And I thought his performance, I guess let me look and see how old he was at the time.
He's 22 now, so he'd have been around...
11,
12, yeah.
Well, 13 at the time this film came out. And they don't give an indication of what his age was in the film.
Which is probably wise.
Yeah, but
because the film probably spans part of it in flashback, but September 2001 to early 2003.
Yeah. For a kid of 13 to be on screen that much, and all of the intricacies of emotions he's got to display, and considering that it was supposed to be like a kid with autism or Asperger's, I thought his performance was decent. I wouldn't expect someone of that age to be able to carry a film in the way that he does, and he's really helped out a lot by the supporting actors and actresses in this film. I mentioned to Nate that it's really kind of impressive just how many names are in this film in supporting character roles. Tom Hanks, Sandra Bullock, Viola Davis, what was the other guy you mentioned?
Jeffrey Wright.
And then Max Von Sydow. There's just a lot of really good actors and actresses in this film in supporting roles, and it would have been nothing without some of those performances.
Yeah, they kind of buoyed the kid up. The kid's okay. The kid has a few moments where he shines, but the bulk of the performance, to me, registered mostly as just kind of okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few disturbing images.
We should probably talk about what the film's about.
Yeah, so it starts out, Thomas Shell, who's played by Tom Hanks, or Thomas Shell Jr., I guess, is a jeweler in New York, and he's obviously a very attentive father.
He has these games that he plays with his son
to get his son to go out and talk to people
because
and explore his environment, and all this type of stuff. But most of the early shots are just him interacting with his father. You don't see Sandra Bullock a whole lot.
And they call them what expeditions?
I forget.
Reconnaissance expeditions.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's the elaborate puzzle games that his father creates for him.
Yeah.
To get him out of his shell.
Yep. And it requires him to interact with people and things like that. They print out business cards for him that have all the amateur things that he does, so he can hand it to people and help introduce himself and all this type of stuff. Just real great interaction with him and Tom Hanks, but Tom Hanks is down for a meeting in the Twin Towers on 9/11 and is killed on 9/11. Oscar Shell, played by Thomas Horn, comes home and finds the messages from his father on the answering machine. And in an attempt to try and spare his family the pain of listening to those messages, he replaces the answering machine with a brand new one that he's just recorded the outgoing message on.
He sneaks out at night on September 11th, goes to a Radio Shack, finds an identical answering machine, goes out and replaces it, keeps the other answering machine and hides kind of a little treasure cupboard with various mementos of his father, to whom he was very close, and just kind of obsesses over his father.
Yeah.
And then the inciting incident...
It's a little over a year after September 11th. He goes into his father's closet one day, and he's trying to get a camera off of a shelf, and he knocks this blue vase off the shelf. And when the blue vase breaks on the floor, inside it is an envelope, and inside the envelope is a key. And on
the envelope there's the word Black, or the name Black.
The name Black. And so Oscar believes that this is a adventure that his father was working on setting up for him, and that this is a
reconnaissance expedition,
and he obsesses and fixates on this and decides, I'm going to figure out what this key is to. And so he goes and meets with a locksmith trying to figure out what it is. That's when he finds out the name Black is printed on the envelope. He's missed that up until he meets with the locksmith, and then he starts just looking up. He takes phone books and finds every Black in the 5 boroughs, and creates a plan and a map, to go out and meet him and start looking to see if he can find what this key goes to.
400 some odd Blacks, which to me seems like there would be more people with that name in New York, but that's fine.
Yeah. And so then he goes out on adventures on Saturdays and Sundays looking for these people, trying to connect with them and trying to figure out what this key goes to. And eventually he does connect with the right person, and finds out the key was never intended for him, that it was intended for somebody else, and this solves someone else's mystery, but does nothing for Oscar. But he comes back and finally sits down and kind of meets with his mother. But intertwined in this entire story, his grandmother lives apparently in the neighboring building across the street. And they have walkie-talkies that at various times he'll talk back and forth with his grandma. And his grandma has a quote-unquote renter living with her.
And the renter start about 3 weeks after 9/11, and she hadn't let out this room previously. But 3 weeks after 9/11, all of a sudden there's this old guy living there that Oscar is not supposed to talk to or interact with.
And there's actually some kind of entertaining scenes, like he's over there taking piano lessons from his grandmother, and he's asking his grandmother questions about the renter. And at one point she says to him, if you ever see him, don't talk to him, because he's really mean and he's probably going to yell at you or something like that, you know. Kind of creates this expectation.
Even though he's mute.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of part of the point, is just avoid the interactions that will then cause Oscar to become more interested in this person. But one night, Oscar's trying to get his grandmother on the walkie-talkie, and there's an unexplained absence why his grandmother's not there.
They never explain why she's not there.
No, but all of a sudden the renter's light starts flashing, and Oscar relatively quickly figures out that it's Morse code and starts interacting with the renter via Morse code. And then he takes it upon himself to cross the street again in the middle of the night one night and goes over to his grandmother's apartment, lets himself in, and meets the renter.
Who's Max Von Sydow.
Yep, played by Max Von Sydow. And that's his character, or his...
He's credited as the renter.
His credited role in the movie is the renter, but his name in the movie is Thomas Shell Sr.
Yeah. And we find out, and I called it instantly. It's like, who else could this be? This guy's the grandfather. Because we learned that Thomas Shell Jr., one of the reasons he's such a great father is his father was not a part of his life. His father was in Germany, something about Dresden, something that he's ashamed of that was in Dresden. And so he basically dropped out of his mother's life when he was like a newborn baby. And so he didn't know the father. And so he compensated by being very good to his son, Oscar.
Yeah.
And then, ironically, we later find out that Thomas Sr. also lost his parents in the war.
Age, yeah.
So there's that similarity there, which is interesting.
Yeah. It's a great performance by Max Von Sydow.
He doesn't say a word.
As the renter, he comes, Oscar starts telling him that night that he comes over and meets him, tells him about this adventure he's been going on, and invites him to come with him, and tells him where to meet him. And the first time they meet for one of these adventures, he gives him a questionnaire with 15 questions and the rules of him coming along with, and the renter starts accompanying Oscar on his adventures to try and find these people, and they have some interesting conversations. The renter can only write down his responses and his questions on a piece of paper in a notebook and hold it up for Oscar to read, and Oscar vents and expresses himself verbally. The other interesting part is the renter has tattooed on his left hand the word yes and his right hand the word no. So for simple questions, he just holds his hand up to answer the simple questions. But it's just a great performance by Max Von Sydow. At one point, he decides that he's causing more pain than he is providing benefit, and he just takes off again. Just grabs his suitcase and leaves. And that's kind of a touching scene, as Oscar realizes that he's trying to leave and meets him at the taxi and yells facts about his father, which is the renter's son, as the taxi's driving him away. Eventually, Oscar writes a letter to everyone that he's met on his adventure, including Thomas Shell Sr., and actually asks him to come home. And that was kind of a touching closing scene when the grandmother comes up the stairs and he's sitting by his suitcase at the top of the stairs. She walks past him without saying anything and then just sets the groceries down and keeps walking, as the cue for him to pick up the groceries and follow. And yeah. But I mean, this movie is more, I don't know, in my opinion, it's kind of more about the performances and the interactions than it is per se directly the storyline.
Well, what I came to realize this movie is about, I mean, on the surface, it's about 9/11. It's about dads.
Yeah.
It's about father-son relationships. There were three principal ones in it. The one, between all three generations of Shells. And then Jeffrey Wright's character, we find out that the key has to do with his father, who he was semi-estranged from, and who died a few years prior. And Thomas Shell Jr., as a jeweler, was assisting with the estate sale.
Yeah.
And he had ended up in possession of a vase which he was going to use as a anniversary gift.
Present,
Their
yeah.
anniversary was September 14th.
He went to the estate sale, and it was essentially, the guy says that he basically just gave him the vase. He didn't,
Didn't bother to sell it or keep track of who he gave it to. And it turns out that in that vase was the key, which Oscar finds when he shatters the vase while looking through his father's stuff. There was a little bit, the safety deposit box thing. It's like, I get why that's there, and I get it's a necessary plot device. But my father passed away, and we couldn't find the key to his safety deposit box, so the bank had to basically cut it open.
Uh-huh.
So Jeffrey Wright didn't have to wait for the key. He could have gotten in another way. But for the purposes of the movie, it worked.
Yeah.
And that little scene between Jeffrey Wright and the kid is one of a handful of really standout scenes in this film.
That scene apparently took 4 days to film.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So that, the ones that I wrote down that I was really impressed with is the conversation on the phone between Sandra Bullock and Tom Hanks on 9/11.
Yeah.
That was, most of Sandra Bullock's acting in the movie was in that one scene. The scene where Oscar is telling his grandfather about all the different the blacks that he's met as he's gone through searching everybody in the 5 bureaus with that name, and how he's getting frustrated. And the scene where he tells the renter about the recordings.
Oh, yeah.
Which he hadn't, he hid
He
this from his
hasn't told
mother.
anyone about him. Yeah.
And by implication, they never, in any scene in this film, indicate that he ever tells his mother that he has these recordings.
Yeah.
Possibly that's dealt with more in the book. But I kind of like the ambiguity of that.
Yeah. Well, and the renter walks out before he can play. He plays him 5 of the 6 messages and just refuses to even hear any portion of the 6th one, just stands up and walks out. And says, I'm done. I'm not coming with you on your adventures anymore. That was a very touching scene. But yeah, in my opinion, it's a good film. I am quite surprised by its rating on various platforms. You said you thought it had a less than 50% on Rotten Tomatoes?
It's like 47%.
On IMDb, it gets 6.9 as its aggregate score. 6.9 out of 10 stars with 96 or 95,000 ratings. We also kind of talked a little bit off the recording about the box office numbers. IMDb is referencing that it had an estimated budget of $40 million, and its worldwide gross was a little over $55 million. So, with the advertising type of things included, that's essentially just a break even, which for an Oscar-nominated best film with such strong performances and big names, I'm quite surprised by those numbers. I'm quite surprised by its lackluster performance. Now that you've seen it, what do you think of the ratings and box office numbers versus what you might have thought if you'd seen this contemporaneously?
Well, it might be interesting to go back and see what else was in the theaters around the time this came out, because that could very well be a factor. It came out around the 10th anniversary, and I don't know if that hurt it or helped it.
It came out a little bit after the anniversary. I don't remember exactly when it was released. But it
would
was
have been
not
late 2011.
It was late 2011. It was not done in time to come out for the anniversary of 9/11.
And I don't know if people wanted something like this at that time or didn't want something like this at that time.
Yeah, I don't know.
One of the things that I had thought about this as well is, and we had also discussed that, I think we may have already discussed that on this recording, just the issues I have with the 9/11 in a film. Yeah, I believe we did discuss that.
I mean, you can talk more about that.
I feel it, but I don't have it completely verbalized. Like what it is, I don't know if I could completely verbalize. But there's something about that just seems a little exploitive, and I'm just like, I'm not instantly open to it. I put up a guard.
Yeah. One thing that kind of stands out to me about this film is it seems like there is a fair amount of things that they filmed that are left on the cutting room floor.
It does have the feeling that there'd be some interesting deleted scenes.
Well, but then I also learned that James Gandolfini filmed an entire role for this movie that was entirely cut out because it was negatively had a negative reception on early screenings. So knowing that, there's clearly more.
Well, we learned that he played a grief counselor that was working with Sandra Bullock. And I think that's a wise cut, even not having not seen the scenes, that would have just slowed it down.
Yeah.
The extent of what we get of Sandra Bullock is all directly related to the son, because it is that son story, other than the moment between them when they're talking on the phone on 9/11, which I'm glad is in there. But I don't think the grief counselor stuff would have added anything to this film.
No, but I get the impression that even with the characters that we do experience, that there's more that was left on the cutting room floor. I feel like there were some that was left on the cutting room floor or woven in at a different point with Sandra Bullock having discovered Oscar's adventure that he's going on.
Yeah, there's that thing at the end.
They end up weaving it in at the end as her saying, I've known about this, I've been aware of this, I've been doing this ahead of you.
It's like in a caper film where they show one thing, they're like, oh, this was going on in the background the whole time, and they go back and they show that she was aware of what he was doing on the weekends.
I think it was probably filmed and intended to be inserted kind of as it went in the film, along with some other plot lines.
I think the intent was for it to be kind of the reveal at the end.
And again, neither one of us has read the book, so we don't actually know this.
That's true.
But I feel like there was just more missing with that. And you only get certain interactions with Oscar and the people that he's going out and meeting. I think that's probably good. Like the Viola Davis one and a couple of the other people. Viola Davis is good in this. She's always good in it. Well, and she ends up coming back into it.
And this is the year of The Help, which really established her.
But yeah, I really enjoyed this film. I don't think it's, by any means a perfect film or a, over-the-top, high-rated film. I think it was a strong contender for Best Picture in 2012. Or in my mind, it should have been a strong contender. There's still a couple that I haven't seen from that year, including The Descendants. I'm not saying it necessarily should have won Best Picture, but that was my vote in 2012. But again, and I've mentioned this multiple times, Max von Sydow should have won the Best Oscar.
It'd be interesting to see
actor
Christopher Plummer's performance that he won for, which you were saying had been a part that
Max von Sydow turned down that role.
Yeah, and he turned it down.
Yeah.
And I wonder how he feels about that, or how he felt about that.
Yeah, and Christopher Plummer ended up winning it for that role. So it'll be interesting. I feel like there was probably also a little bit of Max von Sydow's performance left on the cutting room floor. I don't see how it could have added much more, in the final edit, but I feel like there was some that was left on the cutting room floor. Again, you've mentioned that this is a film you kind of need to process, but for the sake of the podcast, at this point, how would you rate this film?
2 to 2.5 stars.
Yeah,
probably 5 or 6 on a
10-star scale.
10-star scale.
Huh. I thought you might have liked it a little bit more than that. I'd say this is a solid 3-star film on the 4-star scale, and on the 10-star scale, for me, this is somewhere between a 7 and an 8. You could convince me it's a 7, you could convince me it's an 8, but right in that range. But again, it's a film you probably ought to see just for Max von Sydow's performance, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Tom Hanks has a beautiful, little role at the beginning of the film. He's outside of the first half hour of the film. He's not in it at all.
Yeah. His voice occasionally.
Yeah.
And Sandra Bullock has a moment or two that is good. One thing that struck me as amusing is that his name is Oscar and his parents are Academy Award winners.
Oh. I hadn't thought of that.
As is his grandparents, so he has a lot to live up to.
Yeah.
Though this kid isn't in anything. Like he did this and some a space camp movie.
Yeah.
And he was on Jeopardy, we learned.
Yeah.
And, so I think that's probably best. I don't think this kid's really an actor. He was satisfactory for this performance. He had a few moments that I thought were really strong. I thought this whole movie had a few moments that really worked. But the underlying concept of it, the gimmicky nature of it, just kind of turned me off.
Well, good. Anything else you want to say about this film?
No.
Cool. Well, I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
This is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast.